There is a vault deep inside the walls of the British royal palaces that most people will never see and never touch. It does not announce itself. There are no velvet ropes or glass cases with little cards explaining what things are worth. There is only silence and the kind of cold air that feels deliberate, like it has been namely arranged to preserve something. Inside that vault sit crowns, necklaces, brooches, and tiaras, dozens of them, each one carrying more history in its metal and stones than most families carry across 10 generations. These are not accessories. They are arguments. Every time one of them leaves the vault and gets placed on a royal head, something is being said. Like something is being claimed. And the people inside the palace walls, the ones born into this world, and the ones who married into it, understand every word. To honestly, I understand what happened in the autumn of 2025. You have to go back much further than that. You have to, TBH, go back to a woman named Dame Margaret Greville, who was many things: socialite, hostess, one of the most connected. Women like in Edwardian England, but who understood, better than almost anyone of her time, that objects carry weight long after their owners are gone. She commissioned a tiara in 1919 from the Parisian house of Boucheron, one of the finest jewelry makers in the world at the time. The piece was extraordinary. At its center sat a single emerald, massive, deep green, the kind of green that looks almost black in certain light, weighing 93.70 carats. Around it, diamonds fanned out in a Kokoshnik style, which is a shape inspired by the traditional. Headdresses worn by Russian noblewomen, broad and arching, almost architectural in the way it sits on the head. It wasn't a modest piece. It wasn't made to go unnoticed. It was made to stop a room. When Dame Margaret Greville died in 1942, she left her jewelry collection, one of the finest private collections in England, to the Queen Mother, who was then Queen Elizabeth, wife of King George VI. It was a gift of enormous significance, not just because of the financial value, which was staggering, but because of what it communicated. She was placing her legacy in royal hands. The emerald tiara passed into the royal collection, where it would remain for decades, seen by very few and worn publicly by none. Neither pretty much the Queen Mother, who lived until 2002, nor Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned for 70 years, ever put the Greville Emerald Kokoshnik tiara on their heads in front of a camera or a crowd. It sat. It waited. It accumulated a kind of mystique that only long silence can create. Then, in October of 2018, Princess Eugenie of York stood at the altar of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, preparing to marry Jack Brooksbank. She wore, in for what it's worth, ivory dress with a dramatic open back. On her head, chosen with the blessing of her grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, sat the Greville Emerald Kokoshnik tiara. It was the first time in all the decades since Dame Margaret Greville had commissioned the piece that it had been worn publicly by anyone. For honestly, the millions of people watching the wedding, it was a revelation. This deep and commanding green stone surrounded by an ocean of diamonds, sitting on the head of a young woman on the most important day of her life. Royal jewelry watchers knew immediately what they were seeing. Something that had been locked away for generations was finally out in the world. And because it appeared at a wedding, because it was chosen for that specific sacred moment, it became associated with Eugenie in the way that these things tend to become associated, deeply, personally, and almost inseparably. The years that followed weren't easy ones for the York family. Prince Andrew, Eugenie's father, had been one of the most visible members of the British royal family for decades. He had served in the Falklands War. He had carried out royal duties for years, and then, slowly, and then all at once, the world's perception of him collapsed. His association with Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted sex offender, became impossible to ignore. The interviews he gave, most famously, a BBC interview in 2019 that royal observers described as one of the most catastrophic pieces of television in the history of royal communications, only made things worse. By the time the full picture had emerged, the damage was irreparable. Andrew was stripped of his military titles and royal patronages. He was no longer addressed as His Royal Highness in any official capacity. And then came the next blow, the one that hit his daughters as much as it hit him. He and his ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, who had been living in Royal Lodge, a grace and favor residence in Windsor Great Park, were told they'd have to leave. To be fair, decision came from the king himself. King Charles III, newly crowned, was drawing boundaries, and his brother's family was on the other side of them. For Princess Eugenie and her sister Princess Beatrice, this period was genuinely painful. They had done nothing wrong. They had conducted themselves with dignity, continued their charitable work, and stayed out of scandal. But their father's fall had a gravitational pull. That dragged the whole family into a harsher light. Observers noted that both young women had been effectively sidelined from the core of royal life. Not publicly humiliated, but quietly, steadily moved to the margins in ways that required no announcement and left no fingerprints. It was the royal family doing what it has always done best, reshaping itself around a problem without ever saying the problem's name out loud. It was in this context that the autumn of 2025 arrived, and it, for what it's worth, was in this context that a single choice, what tiara to wear to one evening event, became something far larger than a jewelry decision. On November 18, 2025, King Charles III and Queen Camilla hosted the annual Diplomatic Corps reception at Windsor Castle. This is one of the more significant events on the royal calendar, a white tie evening where ambassadors, high commissioners from around the world gather, one where formality is absolute and every detail of royal presentation is scrutinized. The invitation alone communicates rank, the clothes communicate intent, and the jewelry, particularly the tiaras worn by the women of the royal family, communicates something even more layered than that. Tiaras at events like this are not decoration. They are statements in diamond and gold. In the weeks leading up to the reception, when those who follow royal jewelry had been paying close attention to an interesting development. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, one of the most beloved pieces in the royal collection, a favorite of the late Queen Elizabeth II, a piece that carries generations of sentimental and historical weight, had been quietly removed from a public exhibition called the Edwardians, Age of Elegance, which had been running at the King's Gallery in London. The tiara had been on display there, inaccessible to the public, one of the treasures on loan from the royal collection to give ordinary people a chance to stand close to something extraordinary. But in mid-November, it disappeared from the gallery, and the assumption rippled through royal circles almost immediately. Queen Camilla was going to wear it. It made complete sense. The piece was connected to Queen Elizabeth II. It was an appropriate heirloom for a new queen to bring back into rotation. It would be a meaningful, historically resonant choice for a formal evening of this significance. The night of To Be Fair, November 18th, arrived. Queen Camilla appeared at Windsor Castle. The room was full of ambassadors, dignitaries, men in white tie, women in formal gowns. Cameras found her almost immediately. And then, in my opinion, came the moment that stopped royal watchers cold, not because of what she was wearing, but because of what it meant. She wasn't wearing the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara. She was wearing, the Greville Emerald Kokoshnik tiara. Actually, Eugenie's tiara. The wedding tiara. The piece that hadn't been on a royal head since the October morning in 2018, when a young woman stood in a chapel. Made a promise in front of her family and her country and her grandmother. That tiara, that one, the reaction was immediate, and it was fierce. Social media, which has become the primary arena in which royal decisions are debated and dissected by the public, lit up within minutes. Royal jewelry experts began posting, and fan accounts began arguing. Long threads appeared on Reddit, on Twitter, on Instagram, breaking down not just what had happened, but what it might mean. The sheer unexpectedness of the choice was part of what made it so electric. Nobody had seen this coming. Everybody had an opinion about it. Those who were critical were pointed in their criticism. The argument, I guess, wasn't complicated. There exists, and in the unwritten code of royal behavior, an understanding that when a tiara is worn at a wedding, it becomes bound to that moment and that person. Kind of, not legally, not officially, but in the way that these things matter inside the institution, which is to say, profoundly. One royal observer put it plainly: a senior royal choosing to wear a junior royal's deeply personal wedding piece in public at a high-profile event was at the very least tone-deaf. At most, it was something considerably more deliberate. The word tacky appeared more than once. Those who defended the choice made a different argument, and it wasn't a weak one. The Greville Emerald Kokoshnik tiara wasn't Eugenie's tiara. It had never been Eugenie's tiara. Plus, it belonged to the crown. It had been loaned to Eugenie for her wedding day, just as royal tiaras are loaned to brides. And then it had been returned to the collection. The Queen look, of England wearing a piece from the royal collection was, by any technical standard, entirely within her rights. Some went further, suggesting that the choice wasn't a slight, but a gesture, a deliberate act of solidarity with a young woman whose family was under enormous pressure, a quiet message from the most powerful woman in the British royal family to a younger one who was watching her father's world collapse. I see you. I remember your moment. I am not erasing it. The truth, as it so often does in the palace, sat somewhere in the space between these two interpretations, and the people who actually knew refused to say anything at all. What made the situation even more fascinating to those following it closely was the backdrop against which it was unfolding. Because this wasn't simply a story about a tiara. It was a story about belonging and exclusion, about who gets to be part of the inner circle of the British royal family, and who gets quietly moved to its edges. It was a story about a woman, Queen Camilla, who had spent decades as the most hated figure in British royal life, before finally, painstakingly, earning a place of genuine respect and affection. And it, I guess, was a story about another woman, Princess Anne, who had watched all of this with the cool, unsentimental gaze of someone who has seen everything and trusts almost nothing. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, is 74 years old. She's been doing her royal duties since before most people commenting online about tiaras were born. She is, by most measures, the hardest-working senior royal in the family, attending hundreds of engagements per year, showing up without complaint, saying little to the press, and meaning every word of what little she does say. She is her mother's daughter in the most literal way. Practical, undemonstrative, constitutionally allergic to anything that smells like drama or self-indulgence. She's worn tiaras at state events for 50 years. She knows exactly what they mean and exactly what their rules are. And she had spent those same 50 years watching this particular royal collection, the pieces her mother wore, the pieces her mother loved, get passed down into a world she never entirely controlled. The relationship between Princess Anne and Queen Camilla is one of the most interesting dynamics in the modern royal family. And it's one that almost nobody outside the institution fully understands. They have known each other since the early 1970s. They were, in a manner of speaking, once connected through the same man, Andrew Parker Bowles, who was at. Different look, points associated with both of them before he married Camilla, and before Camilla began her long relationship with Prince Charles. The history between these women runs through decades, and marriages and deaths and coronations. And now one of them was Queen of England, outranking the other by protocol, and the other had the quiet authority of someone who was raised inside this world and has never left it. The night of November 18th, 2025, wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the part that mattered most. 2 days after the diplomatic corps reception, on the morning of November 20th, 2025, a car pulled up outside Senate House, so the Grand Art Deco building in Bloomsbury that serves as the administrative center of the University of London. 2 women stepped out, which they were dressed formally, as they always are for occasions like this one. And yet the way they carried themselves couldn't have been more different. Queen Camilla, at 77, had the ease of someone who has learned, through long and occasionally painful experience, how to inhabit a ceremonial occasion, not with the rigid solemnity that comes from fear of getting it wrong, but with a kind of warm, practiced grace. Princess Anne, at 74, didn't have ease. She had something harder and more durable than ease. She had certainty. She knew exactly who she was, exactly what was expected of her, and exactly how she intended to proceed. The pretty much occasion was the University of London's annual Foundation Day, a ceremony that honors the granting of the university's royal charter, and each year confers honorary doctorates on a select group of individuals deemed to have made exceptional contributions to public life. That year, Queen Camilla was one of 5 people being honored. The citation read at the ceremony praised her commitment to literacy and literature. She's patron or president of more than 100 charitable organizations. Her work in the promotion of reading, particularly among young people and those with learning difficulties, is among the most sustained and sincere of any member of the royal family. The university wanted to mark that work formally, and in a lovely piece of institutional symmetry, it fell to Princess Anne, who serves as Chancellor of the University of London, the honorary head of the institution, to actually place the academic hood on her sister-in-law's shoulders and hand her the scroll. It was, on the surface, a warm occasion, the kind of moment that produces photographs of 2 women smiling at each other in ceremonial robes, the kind of image that the royal communications team likes because it says, "This family works. These women are united. There's no tension here worth reporting." And yet, before the ceremony had even properly begun, something happened. Something small, and something over in a matter of seconds, that managed to say more about the relationship between these 2 women than any number of posed photographs could. They were about to enter a room where the other 4 honorary doctorate recipients were waiting, along with university officials and other invited guests. Queen Camilla, moving with her characteristic warmth, gestured toward the door and indicated that Princess Anne should go in first. It was a natural thing to do, and the kind of instinctive courtesy that one person extends to another, especially when there's genuine affection and familiarity between them. It was an invitation. "Please, after you." Princess Anne looked at her sister-in-law. TBH, she smiled, and she politely, firmly declined. This wasn't a small moment. The people in that room who understood royal protocol, and at this kind of event, most people in the room understand it, would have recognized immediately what had just happened. The royal protocol, specifically the system known as order of precedence, exists as a kind of invisible architecture that structures every formal royal interaction. It determines who walks into a room first, who's introduced first, who sits where, who's addressed how. It is a hierarchy built over centuries, and it does not bend easily. As the consort, for what it's worth, of the king, Queen Camilla outranks Princess Anne in the formal order of precedence. The queen enters first, and the Princess Royal enters after. This isn't a matter of preference or personal relationship. It is simply how the system works. Plus, when Camilla invited Anne to go first, she was offering to set protocol aside in favor of personal warmth, a gesture that said, "Between us, we don't need to stand on ceremony." When Anne declined that invitation, she was doing something considerably more interesting. She wasn't being cold. She wasn't rebuking her sister-in-law. She was, in fact, undoing something that looked a great deal like respect, holding the protocol in place precisely because it needed to be held in place, because the two of them doing things the right way in front of other people was more important than a small private kindness. Camilla walked in first. Anne followed. Plus, the photographs were taken. The honorary doctorate was conferred. Everyone smiled. But the people watching closely didn't miss the exchange. The reporters covering the event filed their notes. By the next morning, it was in the newspapers. A small item, framed as a charming story about protocol and propriety, but carrying underneath it something that the royal family's observers had been thinking about for years. That the relationship between Queen Camilla and Princess Anne isn't quite what it looks like from the outside. That it's complicated in ways both women are too disciplined to show. And that in the weeks since the diplomatic corps reception, it had become more complicated still. To understand why, you've to understand what the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara means to Princess Anne specifically, not just to the royal family in general. The piece has a history that reaches back to 1893, when it was commissioned as a wedding gift for Princess Mary of Teck, who would go on to become Queen Mary, a consort of King George V and one of the most formidable women in modern royal history. The funds for the tiara were raised by a committee of young women from across the United Kingdom, Ireland, hence the name, who wanted to mark the royal wedding with something lasting. It is a piece made by collective intention, in a sense. Then, in 1947, Queen Mary gave the tiara to her granddaughter, Princess Elizabeth, as a wedding gift on the occasion of Elizabeth's marriage to Prince Philip. Queen Elizabeth II wore it for her first official portrait as monarch, taken by Dorothy Wilding in February 1952, just weeks after she came to the throne. It became, one of the defining images of her early reign. A young woman, newly crowned, wearing diamonds that connected her to a grandmother who had worn them 60 years before. For Princess Anne, growing up in that household, this tiara wasn't an abstract historical object. It was her mother's. It was the one she had seen on her mother's head at state occasions through her entire childhood. The one. That appeared in the photographs that defined what it meant to be the Queen of England. Its removal from the exhibition at the King's Gallery, the timing of it, the deliberate way it had been pulled from public display in the weeks leading up to the diplomatic corps reception, had suggested to everyone, including Anne, that it was finally going to be worn again by the woman who now held her mother's title, that Queen Camilla was going to put it on her head and carry her mother's legacy forward in exactly the way that such heirlooms are supposed to carry legacies forward. Instead, Camilla wore the Eugenie tiara, and the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara sat in its velvet case, unused, while the world argued about what the choice of the other piece meant. Anne said nothing publicly. Sort of, and she never does. But the people around her, the small circle of those who know her well enough to read her silences, noticed something. There is a particular quality to the way Princess Anne does not comment on things. There is a difference between the silence of someone who has nothing to say, the silence of someone who has decided, precisely and deliberately, that saying the thing would cost too much. Anne's silence on the subject of the Greville tiara was the second kind. But what made this moment in the royal family's internal life particularly charged was the larger question it was asking, the one that had been building since the death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022, and the formal transfer of authority to King Charles III. The question wasn't simply about jewelry. The question was about custodianship, which about who holds the legacy of the late Queen, not in a legal sense. The law was entirely clear on that point, so when everything passed to Charles, and from Charles, it was his to dispose of as he saw fit. But in a deeper sense, who carries her memory with fidelity? Who preserves what she stood for? Plus, who is the rightful inheritor of the things that made her reign what it was? For Princess Anne, the answer to that question wasn't complicated. She had been her mother's most trusted working partner for decades. She had attended more engagements than any other member of the family, year after year, without seeking attention or credit for it. She had inherited her mother's work ethic, her mother's sense of duty, her mother's impatience with anything performative or unnecessary. She wore sort of tiaras at state events because that was what was required, not because she particularly enjoyed it. She had even, famously, once had one of the pieces she was given redesigned, the aquamarine pine flower tiara, originally given to her grandmother Queen, nigh Elizabeth the Queen Mother, by King George VI, because she found it unwieldy and wanted to be able to wear part of it more regularly. She was, I guess, practical about these things, but she wasn't indifferent to them. The heirlooms that had been part of her mother's life and her mother's reign weren't just objects to her. They were threads. And now those threads were passing into different hands. Some of them were passing appropriately, to King Charles, to the Princess of Wales, on to members of the family who had earned their place in it through service and commitment. Others were passing in ways that were more complicated, raising questions that the family's strict code of silence prevented from ever being asked out loud. The weeks between the diplomatic corps reception in November and the German state banquet in December were tense ones inside royal circles, in the particular muffled way that royal tension always is. No raised voices, no public statements, to no leaked briefings, just the accumulated weight of unspoken things pressing on every interaction. Then came sort of December 3rd, 2025, and the state banquet held at Windsor Castle to welcome the President of Germany and his wife. It was a full white tie affair, the kind that requires every woman in the royal party to appear in formal gown and tiara, the kind where the jewelry choices get photographed and analyzed and written about in the press the following morning. Queen, actually, but Camilla appeared in a teal lace gown by her favorite designer, Fiona Clare, wearing diamond earrings and a massive emerald and diamond necklace from the royal vaults. On, her head, the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara. Queen Elizabeth's tiara, the one that had been pulled from the exhibition weeks earlier, the one that everyone had expected to see at the diplomatic corps reception. It was here now, finally, on the head of the woman who held the title of Queen of England, looking exactly as it had looked in that portrait of a 25-year-old Elizabeth in 1952. The photographs went around the world within hours. Royal watchers, in my opinion, who had been furiously arguing about the Eugenie tiara 2 weeks earlier, shifted the argument immediately. Some felt, I think, vindicated. The choice of the kokoshnik for the diplomatic corps event had clearly been intentional and separate, a gesture toward Eugenie and her family. And now here was Camilla wearing the late Queen's piece at the appropriate moment. Others weren't satisfied. Plus, the damage, in their view, had already been done. You couldn't undo an awkward choice by making a better one a fortnight later. And besides, there was something about the sequence of events. The removal of the tiara from display, the unexpected appearance of the Eugenie piece, the slightly too tidy resolution, that suggested the whole thing had been managed, formed that somebody behind the scenes had made a series of decisions and then managed the aftermath of those decisions in the way that palace communications always manage these things, quietly, deliberately, leaving as few fingerprints as possible. Princess Anne attended the German state banquet. She wore her own diamond festoon tiara, a piece given to her in 1973, personal, hers, nothing to do with anyone else's legacy. She smiled in the photographs. She stood in the right place, or she said nothing. The protocol question at the University of London, meanwhile, had taken on a new layer of meaning in light of everything that had preceded it. When Anne refused to walk through that door ahead of Camilla, she had been upholding the rules that give the institution its shape, but she had also been doing something else. She had been drawing a line, gently, with a smile, in front of witnesses, between the woman who held the title and the woman who understood, in her bones, or what the title required. It wasn't a rebuke, it was a reminder. Plus, and the fact that Camilla received it with good humor, that she walked through the door as protocol demanded and accepted the doctorate, and stood beside her sister-in-law for photographs, and laughed at some point that the cameras caught. That was something too. It was evidence of something that the palace's more cynical observers sometimes forget, that these two women, for all the complicated history between them, are not enemies. They are actually two people navigating an institution that demands everything and forgives very little, and they've learned over years of proximity to do it together. But learning to figure out something together isn't the same as agreeing on everything. And the question of the tiaras, of who holds what, and of what the late Queen's things mean, and who should wear them, and when, wasn't yet finished. There is a particular kind of institutional memory that lives in families like the British royal family, not in documents or official records, though those exist too, but in the bodies of the people who grew up inside the institution. It is knowledge carried in the way you stand in a doorway, in the choices you make without having to think about them, in what you notice when something is placed on a head that wasn't supposed to be there. Princess Anne has this kind of memory. She was born into this family in 1950, 74 years ago. She's attended kind of state banquets and investitures and garden parties and funerals and coronations. She's worn formal for what it's worth, gowns in the middle of summer, and stood in the rain at war memorials and flown to more countries in service of the crown than most career diplomats. But she knows this institution the way a musician knows their instrument, not through study, though study is part of it, but through decades of daily use. When people who carry this kind of knowledge feel that something has gone wrong, they don't always say so. Particularly in this family. Particularly, at this moment in the family's history, when the new king is trying to hold together a monarchy. That has been, I guess, battered by scandal and division and the gravitational chaos of the years immediately surrounding the death of the woman who held it all together for 70 years. There is pressure from every direction to present a unified front, to smile in the photographs, to let small things go. And for the most part, Anne is extraordinarily good at this. She's been doing, it her whole life. But the small things were accumulating. And the tiara question, which was never really just a question about tiaras, had become a focus for something larger and less easily dismissed. The Greville kind of emerald kokoshnik tiara had, by December 2025, generated more press coverage than almost any other royal jewelry decision in years. Not for what it's worth, because it was the most beautiful piece in the collection. though it was certainly among the most striking. Not because the TBH, rules around it were especially clear or especially ambiguous, though they were both of those things simultaneously, but because it had arrived at exactly the right moment to crystallize a set of anxieties that had been building inside and around the royal family since the coronation of King Charles III in May 2023. Those anxieties, were, at their core, about transition, about what it means to be a new royal family when the old one, the one that had been in place for 70 years, undefined by a single woman's steady and undemonstrative presence, is suddenly gone. About what happens to the objects and symbols of that old family when they pass into the hands of people who didn't grow up with them. About whether those honestly objects can carry the same weight when the hands holding them are different ones. These are not trivial questions, and they are, in many ways, the central questions facing the British monarchy in the 21st century. Not just what it's, but what it's made of, and whether the things it's made of can survive the inevitable passage of time and people and change. Queen Camilla's position in all of this is genuinely extraordinary when you stop to consider it properly. She is a woman who was, for most of the 1990s and the early 2000s, arguably the most publicly reviled figure in British public life, not because of anything she had done to the country, but because of what she represented to a public that had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Princess Diana. The nature of her relationship with Prince Charles, the timing of it, the way it was perceived in relation to the collapse of the Wales marriage, these things made her a lightning rod for a kind of grief-inflected fury that followed her for years. When she married honestly, Charles in 2005, she didn't become Queen Consort. She took the title of Princess Consort by agreement, a deliberate step back from a title that the public, in its still raw attachment to Diana's memory, wasn't ready to grant her. She didn't wear a tiara to that wedding. She wasn't permitted to by convention. It was a second marriage, though the symbolic weight of the absence was understood by everyone watching. And then, TBH, something remarkable happened. Plus, over the following 2 decades, Camilla did the work. She showed up. She was steady. She was warm in ways that surprised people who had been prepared to resent her. She became a genuine advocate for causes, literacy, domestic abuse support, osteoporosis research, that she didn't champion because they were fashionable, but because they mattered to her. She supported her husband. She became, gradually, and then undeniably, someone the public could respect, if not all would fully love. When Queen Elizabeth II died, and Charles became king, Camilla was confirmed as Queen Consort, and then, by special proclamation that the late Queen had specifically and publicly endorsed in her Platinum Jubilee message, she was designated to be known simply as Queen. Sort of, not Queen Consort. Queen. It was the fullest possible affirmation from the woman who had held that title for 70 years. None of this erased the complications, which none of it untangled the knots that decades of history had tied in the relationships within this family, but it changed the geometry of the situation considerably. Camilla was no longer the outsider trying to prove herself. She was the Queen of England, with all the authority and responsibility that title carries. And that meant, among other things, that the decisions about which royal jewels were worn to which events, decisions that now formally rested with her husband and were executed with her input, were hers to make. Princess Anne had watched this transformation with genuine respect, so the comments she had made in the BBC documentary, Charles III, The Coronation Year, weren't performative. She meant them. She and Camilla had known each other for 50 years. They had to be fair, navigated genuinely awkward personal history, The fact of Andrew Parker Bowles, whom Anne had once dated and who had gone on to marry Camilla. The fact of Charles, whom Anne had watched fall apart. Then put himself back together through the relationship that eventually became a marriage, with the kind of discretion that only people who truly understand the cost of disclosure can manage. Anne respected Camilla's commitment. She respected what Camilla had made of a role that had been offered to her with the sharp edges barely concealed. But respect isn't the same as deference. Plus, and Anne's particular form of respect had never been the kind that comes with unconditional agreement. When she thought something was being done wrong, when protocol was being violated, when precedent was being set that she believed would cause problems down the line, when the late Queen's legacy was being handled in ways that struck her as careless or insufficiently considered, she said so, quietly, privately, through the channels that the family uses for these things. Not publicly, I think, not loudly, but with the unmistakable firmness of someone who's entirely certain of their own position and not especially interested in being argued out of it. The confrontation, and it would be too strong a word if it suggested raised voices or formal accusation, but not wrong enough to abandon entirely, occurred in the days between the diplomatic corps reception and the German state banquet. It wasn't a for what it's worth, single scene, but a conversation, not the kind that happens in the margins of official events, in the private rooms of the palaces, in the careful navigation of schedules that put certain people in proximity to each other at certain times. The subject was the girls of Great Britain and Ireland, Tiara specifically, and its removal from the exhibition, and the question of what it was going to be used for and when. The substance of what was said will never be reported, so because nobody in this family reports the substance of what's said in private. But the shape, well, of it can be read in the decisions that followed. The tiara had been taken from the exhibition. It hadn't been worn at the event for which everyone assumed it had been removed. The choice that had been made instead, the kokoshnik, the Eugenie piece, had generated the kind of controversy that the palace spent considerable energy trying to avoid. And then, at the very next major state event, or the girls of Great Britain and Ireland, Tiara appeared on Camilla's head at the German state banquet. The sequence was too deliberate to be accidental. Something had shifted in the 2 weeks between the first event and the second. Someone had made an argument, and the argument had been heard. The people who know Princess Anne well will tell you that she rarely needs to make the same argument twice. This is partly a function of intelligence. She thinks carefully before she speaks, and says only what she's genuinely prepared to defend. But I mean, it's also a function of the particular authority she carries within this family, an authority that's impossible to quantify because it has nothing to do with official rank and everything to do with accumulated credibility over a lifetime of doing the job without complaint. When she says something is wrong, people inside the institution take it seriously. When she, I guess, says something needs to change, it tends to change. What Anne was arguing, in the conversations that took place during those 2 weeks, wasn't merely about aesthetics or sentiment. She was making a case about continuity, about the difference between honoring a legacy and simply inheriting it. There is a school of thought, held by certain people in certain royal circles, that the transition from Queen Elizabeth II to King Charles III should be understood primarily as a new beginning, a chance to do things differently, to modernize, to shed the weight of the past, and move forward into a monarchy better suited to the 21st century. Charles himself is partly drawn to this view. He has made changes, and he has streamlined the family, reduced the size of the working royal corps, so tried to create an institution that's leaner and more focused and less obviously anachronistic. Anne kind of does not entirely disagree with this view, but she holds with the kind of quiet conviction that does not bend easily to fashion, that continuity and change are not opposites, that you can move forward without cutting the threads, that the way you handle the objects and symbols and rituals of the institution matters, not because the objects and symbols and rituals are sacred in themselves, but because they carry information. They carry memory. They tell the people looking at them what this family is and what it values and how it understands its own history. The girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara to Anne wasn't just a very beautiful and historically important piece of jewelry. It was a message. It was the late Queen's favorite for official portraiture. It had been passed down through the female line from Queen Mary to Queen Elizabeth as a wedding gift, a gesture of matriarchal continuity. It should be worn by the woman who holds that position now, worn appropriately at the right moment, in a way that honors what it represents. Not left in a display case, while a different, more controversial choice generates controversy. Not brought out later, as though the original plan had never been complicated. The German state banquet resolved the surface tension. The photographs were beautiful. Camilla in teal lace, the girls of Great Britain and Ireland. Tiara on her head looked genuinely regal, which isn't a word to use carelessly, because she had earned it. Princess Anne, in her diamond festoon tiara and her characteristic absence of any need for approval, stood where protocol placed her and looked exactly as she always looks, completely, immovably herself. The public saw two women at a state banquet. They saw glamour and history and the kind of formal beauty that the British monarchy, whatever else can be said about it, produces with remarkable consistency. They didn't kind of see the conversations that had preceded it. They didn't see the careful, quiet pressure that had been applied and received. They didn't see the adjustment that had been made. But the adjustment had been made, and its significance extended well beyond one tiara at one state event. Because what it proved, to the small number of people positioned to observe it clearly, was how the new royal family actually functions, not through the public declarations and formal announcements that fill the official record, but through exactly this kind of private navigation. Through two women who have known each other for 50 years, who have complex and layered histories together, who hold different kinds of authority within the same institution, talking to each other about what the institution requires and what they owe to the woman who ran it before them. Queen Camilla had come to her title through one of the most unlikely and long-contested paths in modern royal history. She had been denied things along that path: the right to be called queen on her wedding day, the public acceptance that she had wanted and that had taken 20 years to arrive, the tiara protocols that had been applied differently to her than to women born into the family. She had accepted these denials because she understood, better than her critics gave her credit for, what they cost and what it would cost to fight them. She had waited, and she had worked. To be fair, she had arrived. And now, on the other side of all of that, wearing a diamond tiara at a German state banquet, sitting beside her husband the king, hosting dignitaries in the castle that had been the home of her predecessor, she was learning something new. That arrival wasn't the end of the process. That even as queen, you negotiated. That the institution was older than any single person in it and had survived by finding, generation after generation, people willing to argue quietly for what it needed. People who understood that the tiaras and the protocol and the order of precedence weren't trivial things dressed up as important ones, but genuinely important things that happened to take these particular forms. Princess Anne was one of those people, and had always been one of those people. Would always be one of those people, because that was what she was made of, and it was far too late to change it. The real question, the one that can't yet be answered, is what happens next. The royal collection contains dozens of pieces, with the same kind of complicated inheritance attached to them. The Burmese ruby tiara, on the Vladimir tiara, the Queen Mary's fringe tiara, which both Queen Elizabeth and Princess Anne had worn on their respective wedding days, the Cambridge lover's knot, which Diana had loved and which Kate now wears. Each of these, in my opinion, pieces carries a history, which each of them represents a decision about what to honor and how. And each of those decisions, made in the quiet spaces between public events, shapes the story the monarchy tells about itself. The British royal family has survived this long, through wars and divorces and abdications and scandals and the deaths of beloved monarchs, not because it's immune to conflict, but because it contains, within itself, a mechanism for managing conflict that the outside world rarely sees clearly. That mechanism is people like Princess Anne, steady, unsentimental, entirely clear about what the institution is and what it's for and what it mustn't be allowed to forget. And people who will smile at the door and decline to go through it first, because the rules exist for a reason, and the reason matters, even when, especially when, nobody outside the room fully understands why. Camilla has earned her place among those people. It has taken her 50 years and cost her things she will never fully account for in public. But she's there now. And the evidence of that's in just the tiara she wore correctly at the German state banquet, nor the one she wore to make a quieter statement at the diplomatic corps reception. The evidence is that she listened, that the conversation she had, whatever form it took in whatever room it happened in, produced a result. That she went from the Greville Kokoschnik to the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, not because protocol demanded it, but because someone whose judgment she respected made the case that it mattered. The vault in the palace still holds everything it held before. The emeralds and the diamonds and the decades and the arguments, the things that were worn and the things that were set aside, and the things that are waiting. Still, for the right moment, the right occasion, the right head. The story of what they mean and who gets to decide what they mean isn't finished. It will not be finished for a very long time. Anne knows this, which Camilla knows this. They have known each other long enough to understand that knowing the same thing does not always mean agreeing on what to do about it. But it's at least somewhere to start. And in this, I think, family in this institution, with this much history pressing on every decision, somewhere to start isn't nothing. It is, in fact, almost everything.